Hello everyone, welcome. Today we're going to talk about a value proposition, and more specifically, what are the best Eidolons? I have a couple E6 characters, Jingliu and Silverwolf specifically, but I also have Eidolons on characters like my Sealy, and so on. So I wanted to discuss what are the best Eidolons for you to pick up if you are looking to either hyper-invest into your account in the terms of building out a specific team composition, or maybe you're just confused because Acheron's coming out and you're like, oh yeah, DOT is getting really good. So maybe you're considering Kafka or Black Swan, or maybe you want to buff up your Jingyuan and so on. So I want to actually go in depth and talk about when you should consider a Eidolon, because Eidolons are really, really important sometimes, but so are light cones. And so let's talk. Now, the first thing I want anyone to consider is what teams are you using? Are you ignore it? I don't even know why Misha was here in this team, but whatever. Consider your teams. Are you running a hunt character who's a solo single target DPS? Are you running somebody who has a little bit of AoE in the sense that they can attack multiple units if they proc Resurgence? Does your team have natural AoE? Do they synergize well together? What type of team are you running? And who's the staple units? And by this I mean, who are the units that are not going to be changed out? Because if the question is, who is the strongest, that's usually going to be your main DPS unless you have a supportive unit who also can deal damage over time, like Silver, unless you're running a DOT team, which I am running over here. Once you have that down, once you have your solid teams, I'd say decide on and ensure that you're looking at the teams in terms of not just how good are they in MOC, but how good are they in pure fiction. Because pure fiction, admittedly, is very important. And even though it does synergize well with the buffs of the on-banner character, it is still important to consider the value a character may have outside of this. Which is why a lot of individuals say, yes, a DPS is nice, but a support, their value is significantly higher. Even though in pure fiction, I don't think many people need or take supports like either sustains or whatever, it's still important to consider. Also, I really wish we had team entrance animations. Genshin has that, please give us that here. And a new unique background, whatever. First and foremost, we're just gonna go over the best Eidolons for any character. With Silverwolf, it is always going to be either her E1 or her E2. Both of these inherently change the way you play it. E1 allows you to build her out with a bit more of an ult spam oriented playstyle, whereas E2 is a permanent debuff. I want you to keep in mind, this is when an enemy enters battle. This is not something that passively applies. This is an unremovable debuff on enemies. This means that if you're looking at somebody like, let's say in the future, Acheron, who wants debuffs, or maybe you're looking at something like this light cone, her light cone in specific, which wants 3 or more debuffs, or maybe you're looking at a character who might be running Pioneer of Dead Waters, this one here, which wants 2 to 3 debuffs. I want you to keep in mind, because that is a debuff that constantly applies, actually I will show you it here. As you see, once battle starts, they all are immediately hit with that effect resistance down. And so what this means is that every enemy is going to have one constant debuff. This assists in, as I mentioned before, light cones that want you to have debuffs, characters that rely on debuffs, or relic sets that want more debuffs. And so, even though Silverwolf's S1 gives her energy and can change the way you play her with ult spam playstyles or break effect playstyles, E2 helps out so many different characters because that effect resistance minus 20% isn't just beneficial to her, it's beneficial to any DOT team, any team that wants break effects, because break effect, or any team that applies a debuff in general, this could help out your Pela, this could help out anyone. And so I'd say Silverwolf's E2 is very universally applicable, and even though these all technically speaking increase her damage, and this one does increase the death shred you're getting from her ultimate and her skill, her E2 is just such high value that I'd say it's incredibly worthwhile to pick up if you like Silverwolf. Keep in mind, in mono quantum oriented teams, that effect resistance doesn't matter as much because Silverwolf is the only one applying a debuff. Now, previously, I would have said Fu Xuan's E1 is great. Her E2 is just a team-wide revive. If you need this, there are bigger problems for your team. And these are all just additional damage. E1 is 30% crit damage for your entire party. This is wonderful in double DPS teams. However, Sparkle's E2 is great. This is because this is a 24% def down for your entire team. Keep in mind, this applies to all allies who have Cypher. This is something that applies to her talent. Once she uses her talent, which is her elemental burst or her ultimate, the entire team gets Cypher. And her entire team gets her talent, which is an additional DPS increase, it's damage increase. And so this is 24% def shred for every teammate. This affects your Sealy, this affects your Silverwolf, and if you run her in different teammates with double DPSs, like your Jingliu and Blade, this def shred applies to them as well. This is especially valuable if you have light cones that reduce or ignore defense, or relic sets that do the exact same. So, both of these are inherently useful for pretty much any team the characters are in. When going through HoYoverse herself, I'm going to be honest, this additional duration of her talent passive is nice because it means you get one more turn where she's more skill point positive. And the 12% speed is nice, but all of these other ones aren't too useful until E6, which is just 50% damage bonus for the ally, which is basically the entire team. That's nice, it's the equivalent to a Ting Yun, but you have to get through everything else first. And honestly, she's a healer, and I don't think you need that. I will go for it because I like her. I don't recommend it for the rest of you. Now, Black Swan and Kafka are very competitive. And the thing is, with these units, I'd say that Kafka overall has better Eidolon concentration, because if you have Black Swan, even though she applies DOT, Black Swan doesn't have as much value without Kafka. She's kind of dependent on it, pretty much every other DOT unit is. And whilst this reduces defense, or this reduces resistances to specific elements, it's something that you won't get value out of unless you proc that DOT consistently. So instead, I would say Kafka is nice strictly because of her E2. The additional 25% damage increase to all DOT is exceptional. Once again, when looking at E2s, consider how flexible they are with other teammates. That's why this is good, that's why this is good, and that's why all of these are good. Even though Black Swan's is great, Black Swan herself is not slottable into any team, or into as many teams as Kafka. DOT is kind of dependent on her to have value. For Jingliu specifically, I can't say any of these are extremely massive improvements. Yes, E6 is one additional turn within her transmigration state. It's good, but only for Jingliu. Also, please do understand, I know specific Eidolons like this one for Steely and her E2 are great, but keep in mind these are only self buffs, and for Steely in particular, you want, or actually any character, you don't want buffs that have prerequisite requirements. 80% or less HP isn't exactly good. Yes, it's great for Steely, but she wants to kill immediately, so it has less value. I'm sure all of you were expecting this by now, but 20% def down, yes, it is slightly lower than Sparkle's own def down for her entire team, but it's E1 versus an E2. Just go for Ranmei's E1. It's really useful in the team that she's used in, which is kind of, at the moment, any team. Now, Luocha has nice Eidolons, but a 20% attack is less than someone like Sparkle's own E1, so it drops significant value because of that. And while the E4 and E6 especially is nice, it is an E6, and so I'm primarily focusing on the obtainable ones that you can get. Yes, I understand you could max out Luocha in a year's time, whatever the case may be. Maybe you saved since launch for him. I want you to have a more balanced roster rather than ones that are concentrated within 1 to 2 units like me. And so once you have the E2 of a Sparkle, the E2 of a Silverwolf, and Kafka's E1 or E2, or even E1 of Kafka, E1 of Black Swan, you can kind of begin to look at your light cones and see who has the most value for them. And let's talk about that just briefly.